All right, looks like we are off. And so I've been actually wanting to do this for a while. I've had the Well-Grounded Rubyist book for a while, probably for quite a few months. And I have never, I've read the first few chapters quite a few times, but never really took the time to really understand the concepts or even finished a book. I've always had other books that came in its place. So I'm hoping with the Ruby Newbies, now that we're done with the Odin project, which all the Odin project is available for you. Um, Sorry, actually, I won't provide a link. But all the Odin project is actually available for you on the rubynewbies.org site, archives and videos, what have you. But for now, for the next about 2 months, we're going to be focusing on the well-grounded Rubyist, which I just noticed I have a typo. There we go. So yeah, so we're just going to discuss the first 4 chapters. Um, for those who don't know me, I know quite a few people joined or responded back to me about doing this book. So I just want to throw my information out there. Just FYI, the slides are on the group page, but they're also available. They'll be available on the rubynewbies.org site. I'll have to throw them up there for everybody. But just FYI, if you want to get some of these links that I have provided. Well, actually, I think, yeah, I guess it didn't update. I just noticed there's a typo down here on the bottom too, but no problem. I'll fix that after the video. But yeah, this is my information. I've got my Twitter handle. I use Twitter quite a bit, so I'll just start it out there. I'll have my email at the end too if you want to take that down. If anybody wants to reach out to me and talk or chat about some of these concepts, I find that it's actually really helpful now that I actually work day to day doing Ruby, or actually doing Rails specifically. I find it very helpful to with what am I trying to get at? I just talk about concepts openly about Ruby and just help my learning. So when I have the opportunity to learn with other people, that's what I'm looking forward to getting done with this. So we'll just go into some assumptions. My assumption, I guess, with anybody who's actually watching these videos or maybe joining us later on, is that you probably have some experience. I probably should have proofread my slides. Probably had some experience programming or reading about programming in general. You probably made a decision for Ruby, so we're probably already past that point. And more than likely, you've probably written some sort of basic Ruby if you've gone through Codecademy, or you're aware of the Odin project, which we actually just completed I'd say about 2 to 3 weeks ago was the last time we had met officially for the Odin project study group. And then, but there's also an assumption that Ruby might be your first object-oriented programming language. But there's also an assumption that maybe it might not be. I know a lot of people come out of school using Java, and which actually can be very confusing when I pair program people who know Java first, because a lot of their Java code starts sneaking in. But if we have time, we might talk about that a little bit at the end about some experiences with Java. But with that being said, let's just begin. So basically, the format I'm trying to get going is, and it might change. This book's got about 16 chapters, and we might feel that maybe the format might need to be a little different. Maybe we need to actually open up the console and show some code. Maybe that's not necessary. Maybe just talking about concepts is a lot better. I feel like maybe talking about concepts rather than trying to do some live coding would probably be better. I've always had trouble live coding on the spot, either being nervous or just being a little confused on certain things, presenting to multiple people on YouTube videos after the fact, it kind of gets you. So, but we'll try this format. We're just going to discuss some concepts from the book within the chapters. I'm not going to read every single page or discuss every page or every concept. But as far as discussing the main points, is getting a good discussion within Ruby. I think that's going to be the goal. So So that's we also probably identify some extra information available on the sections. Um, so i.e. blogs, conference talks, or even some other books that you might want to add to your list. Ruby is a very dynamic language, and it's ever changing. So like the book that we're actually discussing today is actually in a second iteration, which is it's now at Ruby 2.1. And there are minor changes in between 2.1 and 1.93, which was the other book. The first edition was actually Ruby 1.93. There's some differences, but they're not huge, which one we'll actually discuss towards the end of the presentation. So with that being said, let's just jump right into Chapter 1, which Chapter 1 was all about bootstrapping your Ruby literacy. So I was actually discussing with Horvath earlier. The first 4 chapters are basically just a review. So if you went through any other basic Ruby, like Beginning Ruby is a popular book. Also, Chris Pine's Learn to Program is another book. And those books can basically be summarized in the first 4 chapters of this book. Once you get outside the first 4 chapters, then we start getting into more details about Ruby and getting more into discussions and how things actually work. But this is going to be a review for a lot of people who already are familiar with Ruby or have been coding in Ruby for a little bit. Or I know at the Ruby Monk out there and also Code Academy, a lot of this is this, it's just going to be a review, but it's not a it's recommended to actually review things and not avoid them. I personally have learned some new things just going through this book, even though I'm very familiar with Ruby and have been using Ruby for a while. And I say a while, which is actually less than 10 months. So that seems like a while for me, since Ruby is actually my first language, first complete language, I should say. I have attempted Java in the past, but did not get anywhere with it. Let's move right along to the next slide. So, like I said, this is all about the basics in Ruby, uncovering Ruby, what it's all about. Like I said before, I don't want to spend too much time in these sections, since based on my assumption, most people already have the basic concepts of Ruby. Like the installation section, I'm just going to brush right over it. For one, because the installations, it's different for everybody else. You could be on a Mac, a PC, or a Linux, and it could be different, or also within different installations. I know some people install Rails, which gets them the most updated version of Ruby, and then other people install RVM, which you can go back and forth between the different Ruby packages. But I just didn't feel like it would be necessary to go through that, since that's a lot. Also, there's also this brief section of talking about the internals of Ruby and how it's built on C, and going into some of the folders. That I didn't feel like was something I wanted to really get into a deep discussion on. From skimming through the book, it doesn't come up ever again, so I didn't really feel like it was necessary. But there is a great book called Ruby Under a Microscope, which I've got most people that I've heard that have read it have really enjoyed it, and that will give you more of an understanding of the insides of Ruby. So just saying, I'm going to go ahead and skip past those 2 sections, and we'll move to the next section, which is the IRB. I've got it labeled as the IRB trickery. The IRB is just an interactive Ruby. I probably should have made a note for what the B standard for, but it's just an interactive Ruby console available for you to start with right in the terminal. If you own a Mac, I'm not sure if Linux comes with it out of the box, but if you type in IRB, you should be able to access Ruby. I know Python, it's also the same thing. You could access the Python similar to IRB within the terminal right out of the box. But the best recommendation is actually install the latest Ruby, because right out of the box, I think the Ruby comes with 1.87, which is now since been deprecated, which means they're no longer updating it. So you're not going to get the latest and the greatest of Ruby. And there's no reason not to upgrade your Ruby unless you have a project that maybe relies on an older version of Ruby. But my guess is if you're going through this book, or if you're newer to Ruby, you don't have a project that relies on Ruby unless you come into some legacy code or a new job. But yeah, something to think about. I'd look into RVM. I probably should have had some extra notes in there for recommendations like RVM and different ways to install. But I don't, but I assume that a lot of people have heard of it, or if not, it's easily Googled. Um, so moving along, actually, that looks better. Yeah, and if anybody's curious, Present Boldly is a it is the application I'm using to do my presentation from now on. Before I was using Google Docs, which was fine for what I needed to do. I wasn't really doing too in-depth presentations, but with Present Boldly, you can actually do some of this markdown that I have here, which is pretty cool, and I'm able to add extra stuff to it, which is pretty fascinating stuff. So I recommend if you have any presentations, check them out. So yeah, this is the IRB. If you see here, the IRB will look like this. Um, you'll see the carrots. Once you're in IRB, basically all you have to do is just type in IRB in the terminal in order to pull it up, and then you can actually start running basic math, such as 1 plus 1, and it will return a value back to you. You see here, I typed in x, and it spit back here the undefined local variable or method. IRB is smart enough to give you errors if you haven't set any objects, which actually we'll get into later as far as what objects are and the differences. But just take note that there's a special name error defined for if something does not have a name, or if a name does not define, it'll throw a name error. I think Ruby's got about, I want to say about 20 to 30 out-of-the-box errors that are built in the Ruby core. So if you come across them, they're easily Googled. So if you wanted to, you can actually Google that and find out in Stack Overflow that you should probably name your variable, which later here I do, and I've named the variable 5. IRB automatically responds back to with your answer that you set, and if I were to call 5, then it'll also call back 5. One thing I wasn't aware of, or I was aware of, never actually used, I never found the necessity to use up until when I was creating this presentation, to if you do these commands, which I did skip some of these sections, but there are some commands you could run with Ruby. For example, -- simple prompt will cut out this extra information describing to you where you are and what Ruby version you're in. So if you wanted to actually open IRB and not get, if you want to do like screenshots or whatever reason, you could actually just do that little command there. Same thing with no echo. So if you didn't want 5 to be returned after you set 5 to x, it will prevent the echo from showing. So it would just be x equals 5 and have a blank line after the fact. I think that makes, more probably just go ahead and try that out in the IRB personally if you have a chance. But what I was saying, like after I set 5, it would actually just give you another command so that way you could type in whatever you wanted to. Or you could set it. Put that back. Yep. So that is that. What else? We are. Oh, so some other things to note. There are the following some identifiers in Ruby. Notable identifiers, some things that are reserved keywords that you can't use. For example, if, def, end, any of these words you can't use to set as variables. But with Ruby, it's an object-oriented program or language, which actually in Chapter 2 I'll get more in detail about it, but just note that variables can be set at a local level, instance level, class level, and global level. So with the global level, it can be accessed anywhere within any class, any module. There's no need to worry about where the actual variable is called. Going backwards, but obviously class variables will actually only be called within a class, which we'll discuss later in that section. And then instance variables are actually called within that instance. So if I were to label something within a method, which again we'll talk about later, it would only be referenced within that instance, and it will save that instance to be reused elsewhere. Local variables are not as flexible, and it could only be called within that scope of it, either be a class or a method or a module. It can't go from file to file. With instant variables, it easily can go from file to file. Yep, and it's good to note that methods, you could have a class method or an instance method. Instance methods are actually a little more popular. Actually, they're a little more common. Class methods aren't as common, which I don't go into more detail later. But you're more than welcome to look into that later. As far as the difference between class and instance, it's just some information I just didn't feel like it was necessary to go over. Some more stuff from the book that was in chapter 1. This is the last slide before chapter 1's over, but you can all Ruby installs with Ruby documentation. So you're able to actually call the letters RI, and then the different, if I wanted to find out more about strings in the method upcase, so I've got the string and then upcase, I could actually find out more documentation within the terminal. It's not as common, and I don't think many people use this just because the Ruby docs are available through online. They're all available online, so most people actually will use the online documentation rather than try to use it through the terminal. But just knowing that's available for you, I guess, is good. I have yet to find a reason why I needed to have the documentation in the terminal, though I think it's good to know. So that was chapter 1. Some other things with a rake task. Rake tasks are good. I've never actually built my own rake tasks. I've always updated or changed some other rake tasks via tutorials, but never had a reason to create a rake task. But rake tasks are actually pretty useful within large projects or projects that are going to scale upwards, that you might want to simplify some code that you might run very often. One popular rake task would be actually a popular one would be like rake db migrate, which is a rake task to set your database. But another one would be like rake test or rake rspect. Actually, I don't think you rake rspect. I think rspect might just be rspect. I haven't used rspect in quite a few weeks. I use actually test unit, so we use a rake task called rake test at work. Ruby Gem's also something good to know about. It's just all prepackaged code made from, for whatever reason, to simplify building programs. If you find yourself that you're building a program or using code that's pretty verbose that you build for hand, there's a good chance there might be a Ruby gem out there that will help you limit the amount of code that you have to write or discover on your own. But if you don't, if you would rather discover your own code and write your own code, that's more than welcome. But I highly recommend going to the Ruby toolbox and seeing if there's any gems available for you, which I have another link, which again I'll provide the slides after the fact, so you can access some of these extra links. So that was chapter 1. Kind of went pretty quickly again. I feel like this is a lot more of a repeat information. I feel like chapter 4, there's a lot more information that doesn't really get shared within other books that I want to go in more detail in. But Horvath, did you have any questions on anything that we went through so far?
No, it's fine.
Cool. So basically, the object, then chapter 2 is all about objects, methods, and local variables. I kind of breezed by it knowing that this section was coming next, so that's the reason. But I kind of, every time I talk about objects and variables and classes and methods and modules, I always think of these the Russian dolls, which are the Matryoshka dolls, I think is the name. Actually, I have the name down here. Matryoshka, I guess, would probably be closer to the pronunciation, but I've never heard anybody pronounce it. And I'm not Russian, so I don't have the accent to go with that. But I think of the classes and methods. So, and I'll explain this later, but I just wanted to show this visual picture for some people. if you didn't have that understanding. So if you think of like a method, which we'll talk about first, a method is an action that lives inside of a class. It also live inside of a module, but for this sake, a method could be like a smaller doll. And if nobody's familiar with these dolls actually open up where this doll can actually fit within the first doll, and the third doll can fit in the second doll, and the fourth doll can fit in the next doll. So if you think of the code as in class, methods, and modules, as in the methods fit inside classes nicely, and classes fit inside modules very nicely, it kind of helps understand how the code works. But then I guess it kind of would get confusing, what I'll explain that later with the modules and how they work. But just think of it that way as we go through the next sections. And what we'll start with is actually methods, which will be the smallest version. Actually, methods aren't the smallest version. If you think of a variable, variables can go inside methods too. So that would be the smallest version. But Ruby is an object-oriented program. So if you see that distinction OOP, that's what that means. It's really made its name for itself as being an object-oriented program. Actually, I had this discussion weeks ago with Ashfeen and talking about object-oriented programming and how Ruby came out. Ruby came out, which I apologize, I didn't go through any of the background of Ruby, but again, I made the assumption that most people knew the background of Ruby. But Ruby's been around since the early 90s and was created by a fellow named Yukuro Matsumoto. Short, they call him Mats, which is actually his Twitter handle, M-A-T-Z. And he created Ruby kind of in the mindset of object-oriented programming, but making it a lot easier and beautiful to read. Java came before Ruby, and Ruby's not the first object-oriented program. The object-oriented language, rather. There's also Python, Java. You could even do object-oriented programming in JavaScript. Objective-C is another one. There's quite a few of them out there. So Ruby's not the only one out there, but it's the only one I use currently for production code. I've taken a look at Python, and I'm currently learning Objective-C to kind of get some differences, which has been great to know. But just about everything in Ruby is an object and can be used elsewhere within the program. So for instance, I've got here, we're looking at a talk method. Talk is a method for the object OBG. So the object OBG can actually take in messages from talk. I know that's getting a little more in depth, but if you read through the book, I highly recommend going through the book again if it doesn't make sense. But each object can actually take in messages, especially methods. So if you look here, actually I misspoke. Each object can't always take in messages, so sometimes variables will be all they can do is call different information that's set as a variable. But I don't go into in depth with variables. More for the message, but the period between the object, so if you look in the object and then the method talk, signifies that talk is carrying a message for object. So if I were to call object.talk within the command line, then I would be able to, and there's actually some code that actually is not shown here, which I realize it could make it confusing if you did come brand new from. So let's pretend like, because we haven't talked about class yet, but there is a class called object, and just lost myself. So obj is actually object.new. So if you think of it like that, that's basically what's happening right here. So that's where the object comes from. It's actually a class, and the class, this method actually is going to be within here rather than the end will actually be in here, but we'll get in more detail. It actually gets explained later, so I'm actually over-explaining at the moment, but just know, and it looks like that was a comma too, but just know that this object can take in and pass and receive and give messages. Object-oriented programming is all about sending and receiving messages. There's actually 4 main components to the object, which I'm not really going to get detail, but I'll mention it just because I'm actually reading another book called Confident Ruby by Avi Grimm, and method or objects will actually they do four things. They'll collect input data, they'll send input data, they'll handle errors, and there's a fourth thing that I actually was trying to remember this morning when I was at church, but couldn't remember what it was. I'll have to look at the book again. But yeah, there's four main functions for objects, but that's a whole other book, which I actually do recommend later in the presentation. But yeah, looking here, the receive message return value is what comes after the puts, but note that return is not necessary to write in Ruby. Ruby has a bit of syntactical sugar that doesn't require you to actually implicitly write return, though you're more than able to write return at the end. So if you wanted to return puts at the end, you're able to. But I find myself I'm trying to explain more stuff that's in later slides. So I'm going to try to stop doing that. I'm just going to read what's on the slide and move on. But when I was talking about earlier, just like the RI, they define more information about Ruby. You can see that here, since we have an object.new, or object.new, we're actually printing. This is a little shortcut for printing. Within the IRB, to print something new, just as in print and puts do very similar things. Print, actually, I think print will start you on a new line, but puts will just actually print that line. But just note that the P is just a shortcut to print. But if you look at here, print.new, object.new, methods.sort, I'm calling different messages. So notice that methods, which is here, is actually carrying a message. And the message itself is actually all the standard Ruby methods that can be found in the Ruby core documentation, as I was explaining earlier. And the sort method is just another message or another handler to sort that information, because for whatever reason the methods are not alphabetically ordered. So just taking a look at this, you can see that just kind of kills two birds with one stone. There's more information on your methods within the Ruby core documentation, and there you can see it right there. So I just realized I spent a lot of time on the first few slides. I'm just going to start moving faster to this so we can have a little quick discussion at the end. So if you remember our object.new, which I actually started typing earlier, not realizing that this goes into more definition later. Here you can see I've set my variable, which I didn't go into detail with, but you can do the object.new, which is the variable, and you've got your message here. But if you notice, we've got a new error, which is undefined method, which I was saying that Ruby's got some errors that are set standard that throw errors. Otherwise, you'd get an unknown error. But I think they basically covered all their bases with the errors that are set in there until you start getting some more deeper thought programming. But notice that no method error is thrown, similar to our name error on slide 7, and we just basically what it's telling us to do is we need to define talk. So just like in the previous slide, we're defining talk now, but this time we're actually be calling within all the same section. And it's also good to mention that methods can also take in arguments, which here you could say object.talk and then take name. And when you add that argument in, you can then, when it puts the object, which I have it here with a string interpolation, which is another thing that's been reviewed from so many other beginning books, which I won't go into detail, but it's going to print out the name that you give it. And also another thing to note, that puts is a method, and puts can actually even be written like so. Get into the console. So if you wanted to actually write it the way it actually is, puts it actually just as just as good without the parentheses and with the parentheses. So the I am an object is actually the argument that puts its taking. And if you really think about it, this method has a method what's inside of it. So that's another possibility. You're able to put methods inside your methods, just as you could put classes inside classes. You put modules inside modules, put variables inside variables. It's all object-oriented programming. It's very flexible in that sense. So you're able to do some of that trickery within your methods and stuff like that. So just to note, and I'm going to put a little note here, the parentheses. Anyway, I'll have to do it later. But yeah, just note that the parentheses are sometimes implied. You do, even though I stated that there's parentheses here for name, it's not a necessity to have the parentheses there. So if I called object.talk, yeah, here we go. If I called object.talk, let's say if I wanted to call it elsewhere, I could actually write, it actually will need to be a string. If I wrote it like that, it actually will print just as if I had the parentheses or without the parentheses. So that's another thing to note. Oop. Looks like I'm breaking stuff here. So yeah, it's another thing to note. You don't need the parentheses in order to actually call the method. You can just pick either or. It's probably best not to switch back and forth to avoid confusion if anybody else were to read your code. But that's it for Chapter 2. Moving on to Chapter 3, organizing objects with classes. This is going to be another brief section. I think Chapter 4 might be a little more detailed when I talk about it. So we're organizing objects with classes. So, and I've got Willy Wonka here. So you are a computering teacher. Tell me something I don't know. I didn't have another picture to put there to describe, so I thought that would be fun. So, remember with Ruby, everything is an object. So I was explaining you could put stuff inside stuff and stuff inside stuff and stuff. So just like that doll that we were looking at earlier, you just can throw tons of stuff, which could actually be the bane of your programming existence. If you just hide stuff in random places, it might make it a little harder to come back to your code later. So it's hard to know the balance, which there are other books which I explain, recommend later to kind of understand that balance. But for the sense of learning it now, we're not going to go there yet. But classes are larger methods that hold more stuff. That is probably the best definition of classes that I could think of. But instead of a storage closet, it is basically a 1 to 2 car garage. But try not to keep more than one car in there. That's more of my my words. Actually, I will quote myself. I said that. So basically, you could put a lot of stuff in classes, but the idea is don't go crazy. There's going to be a sense where you probably want to start, if you start throwing in information about a ticket, and then you start defining classes inside tickets about games or events, then it might be an idea to make a new file called events or ticket or games, and not sandwich tons of code about games and events inside your ticket class. Does that make sense? But moving on towards the slides, classes can contain methods, and those methods can continue to carry those messages, their messages. So if you look here, I've got a class and a ticket, and just as we saw before, which I didn't point out, but just to let you know, all methods are defined with this keyword called def, so def, and that's how you define methods. Classes are created based by defining it. Instead of using the word define, we define it with the word class, and all of it is sandwiched within the end. One cool and bad thing about Ruby is that it's very flexible, where if I wrote it like this, there would be no issue with the code not working. But for best practices, most people tab within 2 to 4 spaces. But like I said, if you wanted to throw your end back here, um, that would still work. Um, there's no space limitation with Ruby. So it's a good and a bad thing. Sometimes people can write some pretty crazy code and have stuff everywhere. I found even with my HTML, I tend to try to keep a balance and make sure my spacing is perfectly because or it looks good, because sometimes I come back to my code and I can't find certain things, and I wish I followed the best practices within Ruby. I've actually gotten a lot better now that I'm actually writing more code on a regular basis. But it's just good to know. Try to keep your spacing to look like everybody else's, even though there's so much flexibility. But that flexibility actually allows you to write some pretty crazy looking methods or classes that are actually written in one line, which I'll share at the end. Actually, I'll go into some different things at the end. But something else to note, the initialize method is called on ticket every time you call ticket.new. So initialize is a method that you don't have to imply. It actually comes standard, but you can actually add extra stuff to your initialize method, which we'll see later. But within classes, the initialize method comes with it. And moving on. So with classes actually within object-oriented programming, there's this thing called setters, and there's actually another thing called getters, which I won't explain because it's basically the same thing. It's self-explanatory. Setters set information, and getters get the information. So there's an ability to change the object state multiple times or just once if you wanted to, using getters and setters. A lot of times when you first write a new program, you'll start a new class. You'll start with setting some getters and setters, which here, if you see, so I've got the venue set as the initializer to take it as an argument. So whenever I start ticket.new, I actually will do ticket.new and set my venue and date. And here I've got some setters here, setting venue and date. Sorry, these are setters. These will be getters. And yeah, it's just a lot of repeat code. Actually, the next slide I'll actually go into more detail with, but just note that the ticket is starting to look good. Just because we got more information, this is not just that one initialize method we had previously, which you can see here. Previously, we just had puts. You created a ticket. That's all we had. Now we got some more information. We're actually, getting to the nitty-gritty of how the ticket is going to be working. And sometimes, especially when you look at a ticket to a concert or a sporting event, you're going to have the date, you're going to have the venue, you're going to have a seat number, you're going to have all this different information. And it's different things to think about when you're actually writing your program, whether other information I might need for this object. So for me, I'm writing a church app, which I'm actually excited to actually start up again. I took a month off. Actually, I took about 2 months off writing this app just because I was trying to get a job, got a job, was preparing to start this job, so I actually stopped all my personal projects and have not started. So my goal was, as of August, to get back into the groove of things. And I'm excited because all the knowledge that I've learned since, I'm going to be able to apply it to my application and be able to speed up the process as far as writing this application. But so then now we'll take a break actually and talk more about sugar, which actually more specifically syntactical sugar. Syntactical sugar is just a way for Ruby to make code look a little more beautiful. If you notice ticket.price.
Sorry, Brian.
Normally,
can we get back for a minute?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you switch back to the... Yeah, thank you. I was wondering if initialize is a given method in Ruby or just a practice to code this way.
I believe it's a keyword. Initialize is a keyword that's used. So it is standard within the Ruby class. Let me just check real quick.
Okay.
It's definitely best practice. I just didn't Google it right. Is initialize a Ruby, which is initialize method. Here we go. It's always good to check. Sometimes you'll not be sure if something's a keyword or not. Checking. Actually, Ruby is good enough to tell you, which it looks like it's in this. It is in the standard Ruby documentation. So you could use initialize as another method that does something totally different than initialize, but just note that it's going to act as your initializer. So that is definitely going to run every time you call new. So if you put initialize some random method about adding math or whatever, it's going to initialize every time you hit ticket.new. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
or else, I mean, if you had a discount method, which we have up here, um,
Yes.
that's not going to start at initialization unless you actually call it within that method. So I would actually have to call after my date setters or my getters. I will call discount and then set the percent with whatever argument. Then that way, every time you initialize, your discount is set. Um, but as it's written, discount will only be called if I call ticket.discount, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, that's some things I actually did not until I did the tic-tac-toe app. My first go around, I
Mhm.
didn't even know initializers existed. I went my whole first 6 months writing Ruby, just writing classes just as classes. Actually, I don't think I wrote too many classes because I did mostly Rails. And Rails, like you were saying earlier, you just don't learn the basics of Ruby because
Yes, yes, yes.
Rails does it for you. You type Rails G model and name your model, and it sets everything for you all in the background. So, and then also with Rails, you jump right into my next slide, which is going to be all about attribute methods. So you don't actually learn this portion with Rails, which it makes it interesting in a sense. But just wanted to point out the parentheses, not necessary because of the syntactical sugar, which is a term that will be used a lot with Ruby. But this is how Rails looks. You'll actually have an attribute accessor, which is basically going to be your getter and your setter. Actually, it's not. It's going to be your reader will be your getter, and then your writer will be your setter. But if you use attribute accessor, it's both. So most of the time, I'm using attribute accessor, which I actually just figured out that this handy one, just using the attribute, it actually make it a reader and optionally a writer. So if there's a second argument within your that causes your attribute to write, then it will, which is interesting. So I had no idea about that. So just going back to our setters here, all that code could be simplified by using just a one-line attribute accessor price. Um, and I could see why possibly a ticket you wouldn't want it to be an accessor, so you want to write and read a ticket because you want your ticket to always be that video. You don't want someone to buy a movie. For example, if you go to a movie theater, you don't want to buy a ticket to go see the Lego movie, but then someone goes and to see a different movie, the Transformers movie, for say. You want that to be initialized at the set. So if you were writing a program, actually I met a guy who was writing a program for concert software, for ticketing software. So actually this would fall right into what he does all the time. So I'm sure within his modules or his classes, he's going to have you'll be able to see the venue and see the bands, but you won't be able to change it. So there'd be a reason for reading and writing. It's always best practice to use less and add later. So if you aren't sure if you want it to be written, I would recommend you just go with the reader first. And when you get to that point in the code where you can't write to it and you need to, then you can change that. But you don't want to have access to certain things that aren't necessary. And I did not realize this. I mean, I've got time to go through the next section, which I will. I just didn't. I don't know if you have. I'm keeping you up late over your time. but I didn't realize it was going to take so long going through all this stuff. It's just a lot of information, which I'm more than happy to go through it. So I'm really happy I went through this book, and I'm more appreciative to share it with you. But just appreciate you being on the call or that with me. But this is the final section. This is probably more of the section we'll probably get more discussion with. If you have any questions, just stop me, and we'll go into more detail.
Okay.
But modules and more on programming organization. So modules basically are bundles of methods and constants, and unlike classes, we'll get that in a minute. I actually wrote a lot of this last night. I had the basics, my outline of my slides, but a lot of the more information I just threw in there last night, and it was pretty late. I think it was like 12 o'clock. So there's a lot of typos. But unlike classes, modules don't have instances. Instead, you specify what you want to, where you specify that you want to add the functionality of that particular module. So, for instance, there's a popular module called math, which you can use to add in extra math functions. For example, the function for pi, it's a constant actually for pi, which is 3.14. I remember actually I was solving a problem and I needed to solve for pi, but I didn't want to have to set it. So I asked if there was like I asked my mentor at the time if there was a variable within the Ruby documentation that set pi that I can just call that variable. So pi times whatever my diameter was, and he actually told me just to type in, which I had no idea what this was at the time. I didn't even get to that portion of my learning, but he just said type include. Actually, at the time he said require math, and I think it was even pi, like that. And I didn't know what that meant. I just knew that if I did that, then I could just go pi times 7 and have my answer, or whatever I was trying to do at the time. I don't remember what it was, but I didn't know what that was, and I was able to use it like that. So what he actually told me to do is actually use a module within the Ruby core in order to use pi as a variable already set. Because I could have went, I think it must have been in Codecademy or something that required me to solve using pi, and you couldn't set the variable. So I could have went 3.14, but there's some other stuff within the math module which I'm not super familiar with, which I actually, towards the end, I have an idea of what I want to do as far as the off weeks, because we're going to be doing these book club reviews every other week, but on the off weeks I actually want to and understand some of the basics within them. But yeah, just think of modules as a data set somewhere else. So if you got like a storage closet and the two-car garage, think of the modules as an extra storage outside of your house that you can actually just include or prepend. So getting into include and prepend, that's the first thing that was actually noted, the difference between the two versions of the book. Include has been around forever, but prepend is actually new as of 2.1. I believe it's 2.1. Prepend, we'll get into details later in a later slide, but that's something that's new. But in order to use your modules, you'll need to either call include my first module or prepend my first module. Either or, you have to call that within your file in order for you to have access to all the code that's within there. And we'll go into more details, but classes are subclasses of modules. Think of a module like a big brother that changed. I think I was going for some sort of example that I didn't finish my thought there. Think of a brother that changed the added function. Yeah, that makes a little more sense. But yeah, modules can change some functionality within classes, and they're very powerful. But they can be used in a not good way. So it's probably best to stick with some best practices at first, and then but you can get really creative with how modules you use. Actually, I was using some modules within my work app, which was a lot of fun. But yeah, some more examples. So module tester, if you look at this class that's actually outside my first module, I'm actually including my first module in this class method, which if you notice, this class method literally is that's all it is class, including this module, and then end. And then I go ahead and name my module tester.new, which, like I said, the initializer is built in, so I don't have to actually specifically call the initializer in order for it to be there. But it's a standard, and it's like I just found out it's actually a keyword in Ruby. So mt.sayHello, which is a method that's not, if you can see, it's not in the module, but you're able to call mt.hello, which yep, it's calling a method that's not defined anywhere else but my first module. Modules work in a stack. So this actually works. I kind of go on a tangent here, but it does work. Modules work in a stack, so it's last in, first out. So based on the way the code's written, this will be the last thing that's written. So if I define take from stack up here, it actually would only be defined here. So whichever the last time you call that instance, take from stack, that's the one that's going to be called, which we'll get into more detail later. But just note that you're able to use all these methods stack-like by including stack-like in a different class or a program. It doesn't have to just be within a class. And the term mixin is a term that I actually never realized what the meaning was. I've always heard it, module mixins, mixin models, modules, but it basically mixing in a module is basically calling include in your file or your class. So right now, stack-like is mixed in with stack. So now I'm able to call all those methods that we saw to the array here. I also named put a little note here. This is another thing I wasn't aware of. I've used it before, but didn't have a definition, and I knew what it did. But using the two pipes and the equal sign, it's a conditional setter. So if you did not have stack defined previously, it's defining it for you. But if I already defined stack somewhere else, which is something to note with modules, then it wouldn't set it as an array. But with the last in, first out, if modules was included, then it would overwrite. Actually, it wouldn't overwrite classes. If it was already defined in the class, it wouldn't overwrite it as an array. It would keep the array as is. Yep. And there's a difference. So with require and load, you can also require and load a module just like that, and just like my mentor showed me before. But just noting that require and load actually requires it to be a string and not just the name of the module. You also can't call stack-like.new on modules because there's no initialize method and built in with modules. So that's something else to note. The one way to call it is either include or using prepend, which prepend we'll actually go through a little later. But that's modules. Modules basically it's just again, it's like that big brother that's coming in, saving the code or adding extra code to help you out within your model. It's also used for storing code elsewhere. So if you had a module, let's say I wanted to upload photos to Twitter and I wanted to upload photos to Instagram. Well, I'm going to create all the code to upload photos for Twitter and upload codes for Instagram. But there's going to be a lot of code that's actually going to be a lot similar between Twitter and Instagram. For one, you're going to have to use carry a wave. This is going to be within a Rails project, by the way. And you're going to have an uploader. You're going to have a photo file. So it might make more sense to have a photo module or photo uploader module to be included within the Twitter or Instagram file, if that makes sense. So those are other ways to kind of help keep your code DRY, which are don't repeat yourself, by having a module which could be included elsewhere, everywhere else. And this is again with the last in first out section. If you notice that I've got here within my module M report method in module M, and here I can actually include M in my class C, and this is actually more about inheritances. I'm actually inheriting C from D, and all the information from C is actually already in D, even though D is blank. But if you see here D.new, object reward will actually print what's in here, if that makes sense. It's kind of like a bit of a rabbit trail, but I did not have an extra slide on inheritances, but it's something else to note that you can inherit classes to other classes.
I have a
And
question.
yeah, go ahead.
In Ruby, you're writing all of your code in one file, not like in Java when you create a new file for every class. So is it a best practice to write the modules up and the classes below of down?
Actually, Ruby would. I think the preference for most Rubyists would be to write your separate files per classes and modules. The fall more the Rails standards.
Yeah, in React it's like that, of course, but actually I never seen any big Ruby code, so I don't really know this.
Yeah, one good one is the example in the Odin project for the tic-tac-toe. They throw everything in the modules and everything's separate. I know that one for sure. If you wanted to skim through it, it's a tutorial, so you can actually read through it and you don't have to actually go through the code. But I highly recommend looking at that. I'd probably recommend against using a one-page app if you start getting the modules, because you kind of want to separate the module to be included elsewhere. It makes more sense that way, but again, with Ruby, there's a lot of special things that you can do that are available to you, but aren't necessarily something you want to do that you would want to do for purposes of keeping stuff simple or keeping stuff readable for other people. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I'm just checking one of the solution for the tic-tac-toe. Sorry, something wrong happened. So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just checking one of the solution of the tic-tac-toe on Odin, and I see that they are require the files.
They require the files?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, they have different files for the classes, which is pretty cool. That's what I was looking for actually.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's
yeah.
actually a really good example for using modules. I think they use modules. If not,
This one I'm
requiring
just checking.
files is
It doesn't use. Yes, it doesn't. It just uses classes.
okay. Yeah, because using requiring files is a lot similar as including a module. It works in the same way. Um, Stuff gets overwritten. But if you were to call, which actually I'm going to get into the next slide talking about that, but I wanted to talk about prepend real quick. It's something that I couldn't think of a use case for using it, but there's a possibility that there's something that you would want to use prepend instead of include. But basically, prepend with modules, when you include, actually, can you hold on real quick? Sorry about that. My son actually is
No problem at all.
very hungry, and my wife was getting him a bottle. So yeah, so I was just finishing up with prepend with modules. When you call a method, so if you call the method like we see here in the report within a class, it will actually, if you include a module will actually be overwritten by the report method, the latest report method. So whatever was the last time it was called, um, it will call that report. But with prepend, it makes it so the module cannot be overwritten by the latest definition of report. So if you see here, the module is prepended, and there's also a definition called report. But when report is called, it ignores hello from class and actually says hello from module. So that's the difference with prepend and include. Yeah, that's the same thing for if you were inheriting from another class, you can overwrite the class method from the previous class by just defining it again and using this different messages within the method. Same thing with variables. Variables is the same thing. Everything's an object, so just with all objects, it's like that. Which I think in the next slide we talk about even including modules. Actually, not yet. This is more about error and method missing. Method missing is something just good to note that method missing is under error handling, and you can actually, I don't know if I can explain it best, but just like appending any method anywhere, all Ruby objects are appendable. So you could actually append method missing to do other stuff that you wanted to do. Like, for example, call what message, what the message within the method missing. Not sure why that came up within that portion of the book, but that's the way it flowed. But that's just something else to read. But yeah, what I was getting at was like the modules, if you recall, like via module M and N, I think. Maybe I skipped by that explanation. When you have two different modules, oh, it will call the last module. So module N will be the latest code, the latest report method that returns, which is here, which I kind of breezed by that. But just noting, whatever is called last will be the latest code for if anything's repeated. So if the code has to choose between the same name methods or variables, it will choose the latest, which can be real handy too to use. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but this was my last slide. So modules are basically important. Ruby can be powerful within a Ruby program. Definitely check out more of that tic-tac-toe example. I think I'll probably put a note in here to check that out for more information. In attribute, so when and when not to use attributes attributed to Ruby best practices, but at the end of the day, it's pretty much up to you, I guess, when it comes to your code and how you want it to be written. There are some best practices, but if you want to do something crazy or something different, it's basically up to your code. It just gets a little different. Oh, attribute actually was right to Ruby best practices. Oh, attribute. Yeah, I'll have to reread that sentence. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So modules are also a good source of sharing code between classes, but just note that inheritances are also available too. And like you mentioned, you could also require files too. So if there's a file elsewhere that's not necessarily a module, you can also do it the same way. But the book, I think the book pushes you more towards modules, which I found that modules actually, every time you get to a module explanation, it kind of breeze by it. Maybe because there's not much to talk about with modules. Whenever I read a beginning Ruby book or learned the program, I felt like modules didn't have enough attention as far as the use case as classes and variables did and methods. I think methods get most of the pages in the book. But I think that's just me. Maybe I didn't spend enough time researching them and using them. But I think modules are pretty awesome, and especially in Rails. As of late, within Rails 4, there's been a big push to use concerns, which are basically modules. And I had no idea what they were until I started working in the job I'm in now, and how to use modules in a better way. So before we get like a short discussion, because I actually have to get going, I didn't think it was going to be this late. But next week we'll actually be in 2 weeks. So we're going to go through chapters 5 through 8, another 4 chapters. But we're actually getting into the definition of self, which I've heard is a really good definition within this book. I don't think it's been discussed at this degree within that chapter. So needless to say, that's probably going to be a chapter that we'll probably focus heavily on. I'm probably not going to go through as many slides and all the information from every single part of the book. Like scholar objects, I think I might mention it maybe in a sentence, but I'm probably not going to spend as many slides as I did some of these sections. But I think some of these other things will be more discussion lead-ins than anything else. But again, it's going to be 2 weeks, kind of give us enough time to read through the stuff. I personally, my goal is to finish this book within 2 months. I'll probably finish it with sooner, but I wanted to give everybody else the opportunity to get through it. I know I have lots of books that I've been trying to get through that I just never finish. I'd start and I skip stuff, but I'm trying to get to a point where I can actually get through books, learn Ruby really well, so I can move on to other languages and increase my programming expertise. So I do have an ideas of actually let's talk about this next idea for the off weeks. Rather than going through another 4 chapters so soon, I'd rather just go into maybe some libraries within Ruby. For example, the inflector library is a good library that's actually used a lot within Rails, which
Oh,
I
that's a
just
great
found.
idea. I never
Yeah,
heard about this inflector library since
and
today.
yeah, and I actually didn't hear about it until Monday. So, which I actually realized it's more of a Rails library, but I think it'll be fine to look into it because just to know what's out there.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
I'll try to focus more on Ruby libraries. So next time, actually, on the off week, I'll pick another library that will be more beneficial for Ruby programming and not just Rails. But needless to say, we'll get to see how the modules work in requiring files. So be a little more hands-on using the console and coding and stuff like that. And it'll be less talking about slides and more just kind of talking about how stuff works. So that's my idea for the off weeks. It will be next Sunday. For now, the time is actually going to be later, but I'm thinking of actually moving the time to earlier in the day. But just keep in touch on Google Plus and Twitter. But I think I'm actually going to move that section earlier. As far as the time wise, I'm trying to be a little more flexible for some other people. It's also, since it's more of like I'm not actually following the Odin curriculum with tons of people, and we're kind of just going through a book, I'm kind of more relying on people to watch the video after the fact, and it will be easier for them to keep up that way. I don't expect many people to show up for a book review via the web, but yeah, who knows? Maybe one week we might get a lot of people. But with that being said, I really appreciate you showing up, Horvath, to talk with me live and kind of ask questions and gear the conversation. But that's my information for anybody who's watching this after the fact. If you have any interest in checking out what I use to create the slide, it's called presentboldly.com. It's a free program, and definitely check it out. It's worth a try. This is my second presentation using it, and I really enjoy it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast, and we'll see you next time.